Thanks everybody for joining us today. It's hot in Toronto. I don't know where you are, but it looks like David is also hot by the fan going. We're very excited to be talking about impact measurement. It happens to be one of my favorite topics and something I've spent the last 20 years doing in various forms as it has evolved. Today we have David Goodman, who's been a good colleague, and he and I have had many heated debates over the years about this topic. And he's right now the head of the Bright Hive, head of data trust, or Bright Hive, sorry. And they work to create communities and networks that are able to then share data and measure impact in a very interesting way. So he's really ahead of Impact Measurement 101. So at some point, I hope he tells us a little bit about the work there. David has had a very long and interesting career working both in public and private sector, as well as academia and philanthropy. He was previously the Director of Evaluation and Learning at the Houston Endowment and Managing Director at Teach for America. So without further ado, we'll get started. Just some logistics. We will take questions on the Zoom side, and I'll read them and try and insert them as we go. And then if they don't fit with the conversation, we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. Just for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mariana Katz. I'm a managing partner at Gen3. We are SmartSimple's partner in large and complex implementations globally, and have been so for the last 12 years. Just as way of interest for today's conversation, I was the Chief Operating Officer at the Ontario Trillium Foundation in Canada, and this was in 2014. And at the time, we turned the entire organization from putting money as philanthropic dollars into organizations, turned it from that to a strategy of actually buying and purchasing outcomes. So we really turned the entire organization around from an outcome focus, and we did all that on the SmartSimple platform. So we completely redesigned both our strategy and our processes. So I'm going to start with a very simple question today, David, and what is impact measurement and why does it matter, particularly in today's environment?
Well, let me first just thank you, Mariana, and the SmartSimple folks for inviting me. As you know, I spent many years toiling and navigating the impact landscape, working with a lot of foundations and nonprofits, and you and I have shared many conversations about both triumphs and frustrations, and I really appreciate you reaching out, and really appreciate the work that you've done in this sector, and kind of spanning the sectors and trying to raise awareness, improve understanding of data, measurement, and evaluation. So I appreciate you inviting me, and I don't get to do a lot of impact conversations lately, but it's definitely entwined in the work that I do at Bright Hive. And one thing's for sure, you know, as impact has never been, you know, a uncontroversial or dull topic. And the thing that's always struck me is how, no matter who we're talking to, there's such an emphasis on impact, but very few about, you know, what's the basis of this and what's the kind of the foundation from where we start. And everyone wants to make recommendations for what you should do and how you do it. But at the end of the day, impact is what you want it to be. You know, whether you are a multinational corporation that's doing work in multiple countries, your impact's going to look very different than a rural nonprofit working in an underserved community, you know, whether in the United States or Canada. And it really comes down to what answer or what question you're trying to answer. And this is really the hardest part, I think, of impact, is having the discipline, having kind of the focus and the buy-in and alignment for your organization or for your partners to really just say, This is what we believe we're doing, and this is why it's important. And, you know, it really comes down to what your preferences or priorities are, the location or context where you're working, and the realization that impact can change over time. You know, what it means today may look different as you learn, or you bring in new partners, or progress has been made in specific areas. And that's not something to be afraid of. I think it's something to embrace, because as technology improves, as people become more aware of what's happening, more organizations get involved, that impact should change, and we should all be able to adapt and change what we're doing to both meet the needs of our communities and in furtherance of being really great collaborators as well.
Thank you, David. So, you know, as organizations try to measure their ROI, return on investment, and you and I will get in a minute about what's happening as a result of COVID, because there seems to be, as you and I have spoken, there's a pendulum that swings, right? Before is just give the money, then let's really measure, then the whole field of impact investment and social enterprise, all that evolved, and so measurement was really critical, and now we're in a bit of a changing field. But what could it look like for an organization when they want to do impact measurement, and does it vary depending on whether you're a large foundation versus a small grassroots organization, etc.?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and this is where I think the discipline and the kind of continual engagement within your organization is really critical. And I apologize if there's some noise behind me, but you know, first and foremost, like it depends on you know, what's in place at the moment, right? If it's a new organization that's just kind of starting out, you have a real opportunity to kind of set the foundation from the very beginning. And the reality is that impact may look different within the organization too, whether you're a program officer, if you're a finance person, if you're an administrator, an executive. You know, that's why it's so critical to really sit down and collaborate even internally to create alignment. And it doesn't mean that the fact that impact may look different on different teams or departments, that doesn't mean that this is a problem. It's just that you have to be able to incorporate the needs of different teams, whether it's data or reports or analyses, reformatting data a certain way, meeting certain requirements for different funders or partners. And you know, it also depends on the level of capacity, right? You have to do something that's feasible for what your internal capacity is, whether it's resources, whether it's expertise of staff. So choosing impact that both respects and is appropriate for your level of capacity is really critical. The other thing too is context and location. If you're working in one community and you're doing one thing and you're working with a set of partners, impact may look different than if you were a national nonprofit that's doing work in multiple cities and multiple communities, because those outcomes or outputs may look different depending on the situation there. And that's something to think about as well. The reality is that, you know, everything starts around that conference table, and making sure that everybody's on the same page about what that goal, what your ultimate goal is. And it's fine that it may vary from department to department, but that's all part of your impact story. And you're able to kind of meet the needs of different departments within your organization, and, you know, having your kind of partners, or whether it's a grantee, whether it's a state agency, making sure that their voices and their perspectives and preferences are incorporated into that kind of vision of what your impact journey is, so that you can meet everyone's individual needs, but also meet your collective needs.
Okay. So you and I disagree a bit here, because I think at some point organizations do need, and that's part of our debate over the years, they need to lay out a strategy for what they're trying to achieve, whether it's at the big level is climate change, but then, you know, we want to help local organizations reduce wastage. I mean, it just goes, and building logic models, et cetera. And so what ends up happening then is a lot of them end up measuring outputs.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about because outputs are easier, like number of children attending a fitness program versus did the fitness program reduce, mental health issues or obesity or whatever is happening in that community.
Yeah.
The latter being much more difficult to measure, but to your earlier point, then how do you get access to the right intellectual resources that can help you if you're a small organization versus a large one? So where's that tension between outcomes and outputs, and how do people make that journey? Because it's a hard journey to make for organizations.
Yeah, and I agree with you, especially around kind of the strategic framework. And I agree that like there has to be a cohesive framework that as an organization you are all standing behind. And that the fact that it may differ depending on who you're working with and where you're working. And internally you could, like behind the scenes, behind the curtain, have an understanding of all the different kind of factors that might go into achieving that ultimate goal. So I think I agree with you in principle, and I think in practice, there's some other things that you could do. Yeah. In terms of the outputs for outcomes debate, there's a lot of factors here that I have experienced and heard from folks on the difference. One of them is just, and I hate to say it, but it's just that in a lot of ways, people don't know the difference, right? And so they call outputs that are outcomes, they call outcomes that are outputs. And there's a capacity, there's a broader understanding and alignment across what measurement and evaluation is really doing. And some sectors do it better than others. They have more alignment around that. And others are kind of, learning as they go. But the other factors too is that, for some people, outputs are easier. And I say this, I know there's a lot of funders on this call. It's really tough. I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys have tried to get grantees to all align around a certain outcome and measure it the same way, which would be incredible. We've been trying to do it for decades and for various reasons. And it's a tremendous burden, both on grantee staff to change what they're doing. And in some cases, it's almost easier for funders or governments to get that output data and reconfigure it on the back end to create outcomes, right? So in some cases, it's a convenience factor. It's also really important if you're starting a new program and you don't really know what those true outcomes are. You're in theory building and you want to explore those outputs because you want to understand better the relationship, because the idea is that the outputs are components that will ultimately lead to that final outcome. But in different contexts where this hasn't been implemented, or in different programs with different people, you want to really look at the outputs because they may look different in different contexts. So it may inform what your ultimate outcome is. So in this case, it's a sequential argument. You start with outputs to better understand what you're doing, and then you can better determine if you have the right outcomes at the end. It's also a question of what you're trying to answer, right? It's often difficult to isolate the impact that your organization has on an outcome. Imagine if you were saying, we want to influence legislation or policy, or you want people to be more tolerant. It's really hard to isolate your individual contribution to that outcome. So in a lot of ways, we look at the number of calls made to legislators, or white papers that have been published, or how we've mobilized people for specific things. These are outputs that we believe will contribute to policy, but it's really hard for us to, isolate our overall impact on that outcome. So that's a situation where outputs are really critical, because we can't always determine what we're actually doing. And then finally, I think it really depends on your priorities or goals. There's plenty of funders out there that, and I've heard this, and I know, Mariana, you and I cringe a little when we hear this, but you can't measure what this organization does. You can't measure smiling faces or, things like that. And while I disagree a little bit on that, there is some, I don't want to tell people what their impact is. I know plenty of funders who fund organizations because they're good people doing good work. And we want to just let them do that. And we're not going to hold them to specific outcomes. So in that case, just let us know who you're reaching. and what you're doing. And that's, again, that goes down to priority. That may change over time. And I think plenty of funders have reached a point where they're kind of becoming more data driven and trying to impose some of that. But it shouldn't be that the outputs are inconsequential, because they are really important. And we do want to let nonprofits do the work that they do best.
Agreed. And just to give an example of that, David, we're currently working with a client in homelessness. I can't give more detail on that. And we're helping them design a new program for a particular population. And what we're trying to see is, can we have part of the fund, we want to reduce chronic homelessness by X% by such and such. So it's very much outcome oriented. But then there's a part of the fund that says, here's some money and try some things. So actually the learning and the experiences that come back is really what we're paying for, because that could then lead to more innovative programs that end up impacting outcomes. So I agree, it's not an all or none. You could actually have a blend of, here's some stuff that's feel good and try it out and let us know how it goes, versus here's something that we will hold you to a specific outcome with a logic model, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think this is where the philanthropic sector is really valuable, because they're able to do things like you're discussing here and be innovative and test things out. And, it may be like, that's the first step. Let's just look at what the outputs are. And, we can then decide what might be the best path forward. And it's also interesting too, because if you want for a funder to be able to compare across grantees that are working in the same either context or same subject matter area, comparing outputs and is a great learning chance too, to examine, again, whether or not those outputs are appropriate, but also the impact of those outputs to help kind of inform how the funder is providing funding, or who they're going to support, or do we need to get more help and get other organizations that are focused on other outputs.
So we've gone pretty deep here. Let's back up a little bit. And how can they get started? How can an organization, and again, from our clients' perspective, when they put in a new system, that's a good chance to kind of go, okay, hold on, let's just back up a bit and see what are processes, what kinds of things might we want to measure and reduce the burden both on staff and grantees if we embed measurement in our process. So many of our clients take that as an opportunity to kind of start with a clean piece of paper, but maybe you're not replacing your technology. So either way, how can you get started?
Yeah, and this is often the hardest first step, right? And it's the thing that I always encourage, even if you're a new organization trying to establish a framework, a theory of change or a logic model, or you're an organization that's been doing the same work for 30 years, this idea that this process should be iterative and you should meet regularly to evaluate what you're doing. To your point, like, are the outcomes appropriate for what we're doing, from what we're seeing in the field, from what our partners are telling us or what our grantees are telling us? Do we need to change anything? Are our outputs incorrect? Do we need to bring in a new partner? This idea where as an organization, you sit down both internally, making sure that you're able to clearly define what each team wants and how they contribute to that ultimate goal in establishing that framework, but go into it knowing that it's going to be iterative and you're going to learn and that it's going to change over time. And for an organization that has been doing this for a long time, do the same thing and continue to learn and continue to engage both your partners and your grantees about what they're finding. One of the best examples of this that I was involved in was a fairly big foundation decided to create a collaboration with their grantees and just have them tell them, what we're asking you in our proposals, in our grant applications, is it appropriate? What else are you learning that we're not asking? What data are you collecting that we could leverage for this work? And that, in terms of getting started, that's a great place, whether you're just starting new or whether you've been doing this for 30 years. Because the reality is that the nonprofits and your grantees are the experts doing in the field. They provide a value, and they're ultimately answering the questions that you ask them in those applications, but there's likely a whole host of other information or guidance or insights that you're not capturing. So creating that collaboration both internally and externally is really critical. I do want to go back to emphasizing doing what's feasible. As you start out, you know, choosing outcomes that you currently don't have access to, or doing things around impact and measurement that you don't have the staff to do, is, you know, things that you want to consider. Sure, there's plenty of consultants out there that will help you with this, but, you know, as you're learning or as you're starting, start small. Start with something that you can do, and you tend to build the trust and the buy-in over time, and you can start to get more complicated or start to do more difficult types of things with your work. But do you have the capacity to actually collect data? Do your grantees have the capacity to even submit data? I was working with a fairly well-known foundation in Canada where they said, we've been granting for 30 years and probably 10% of our grantees actually are able to submit data. How can we help them build their capacities to do that? And that's a great point too, because in order to get to impact, there's certain dependencies and contingencies that need to happen before you actually start collecting data. Are our grantees capable of doing this? How similar of what we're asking them is to, you know, what they're doing in their day-to-day work? And those are things, so you want to do a lot of discovery and kind of engagement to make sure that what you're proposing as an organization is feasible given where you're working, who you're working with, and what you can handle internally as well.
So this leads very nicely into my next question, which is really, I mean, you've talked already about internal capacity, grantee capacity being some of the obstacles, and there are ways to work around that. The way we did that at Trillium, for example, was the grantees we use very unique data requirements and very simple. They were very, very simple, and they just had to upload them into the SmartSimple platform. So they didn't have to have their own systems to collect it, but that's just one approach. But other than internal capacity, what other obstacles have you seen, and what are some of the options for people to kind of overcome them and get to the path of impact measurement?
Yeah, I thought this was a really cool question, and one that's potentially frustrating too. The biggest obstacle, I think, is alignment and expectations within the organization. And as I've mentioned before, you know, the impact work may be driven by the program staff or by research staff, but the reality is that they may all have different preferences or priorities for that impact, right? So program wants to collect certain data that's specific to you know, the effectiveness or the ROI associated with that program. Grants staff may want to evaluate the grant and how effective what is being communicated on those applications is reflective of the actual work that's been doing, or how we can relate that to ROI. Different teams and different departments within organizations will have different preferences. So creating alignment and creating buy-in, and also reducing redundancies, right? One of the best examples I've given, I don't mean to hate on Gates Foundation, but they're so big and so many different teams that they are more often than not collecting the same data from the same organizations, and the other teams just have no idea what they're doing with it. So there creates almost inefficiencies and redundancies, and you want to really kind of lay that out on the table so that you're not creating additional burden on grantees, you're not creating additional burden on your own staff, and creating kind of alignment and common expectations and common goals around the organization. That's critical. Buy-in comes from that, where everybody feels like they're being incorporated, their individual team needs are being met, and they're all contributing to this broader goal. Capacity, again, is a big issue. This is one of the most common issues did we bite off more than we could chew? Did we impose too much on our grantees or our partners, given what their current capacities are? And then, one of the big ones that I talk a lot about in terms of obstacles is the external, I call them the Pied Pipers, of impact, that, all of you are getting emails or you're going to conferences and saying, oh, just use our framework, and, just get your grantees to use this framework and everything will be fine, or use this platform, or hire me as a consultant. And great, there's a lot of really good ones out there, but if you don't have your ducks in a row, if you don't have alignment in your team and confidence in what you're doing, those are really tough. And so a lot of the voices and the people reaching out to you, make you second guess yourself and create confusion, and, often will tempt you to take a shortcut. But find someone that's willing to work with you. Trust those that have worked with people before. Ask other similar organizations what they've done. We have a great opportunity in the philanthropic sector to learn from each other. And I think the conferences and a lot of the membership organizations do a really great job of that. But we should be having more communities of practice, both in geographic locations and around subject matters. And, a system like SmartSimple can really facilitate that kind of thing, and be able to both identify similar programs or similar organizations, and help facilitate even the sharing of data. And I know you mentioned Bright Hive, but that's where, we're able to work with companies like SmartSimple to help kind of facilitate those and help examine how similar or different our data is. What are the common insights that we're collecting, things like that.
Great. So you mentioned, again, leading into the next question nicely, this is hard to do without technology, because otherwise you're on pen and paper, and in this day and age, again, there's things that are so affordable and accessible. So what role does technology play in it? And I'm gonna kind of do the follow-up question as I'm thinking about the work you guys do, which for me was a bit of quite the revelation to see what's happened even in the last 6 years since I did this last for a large organization, being inside, not as a consultant. The fact that you're able to bring so many data sets because of AI. So AI is starting to play a role in that. So maybe let's start with a simple question. What is technology? What role does it play? And then what things are emerging that are going to make this even more possible and easier?
Yeah, and I'll say that to your point, the technology has taken, and I know we have some like really great technical folks on this call who are working kind of at the forefront of this. The technology has moved very quickly as we're including machine learning and AI, and even the emphasis on open source technology is really creating an opportunity for people to collaborate and expand this work even more. So from the impact standpoint, and I'll caveat this because the technology can be really great. I will say the technology is only as good as the data you put into it, right? So it shouldn't be the first step, but and often what you do, your impact, the way you do it, and what your ultimate goals should help determine what technology is the right one for you. But the things that it does really well, obviously, the analytics and visualizations, a lot of these front-end companies now, whether it's Tableau or Power BI or some new work that's coming out of UpMetrics in the Bay Area, are doing some really great work incorporating the ability to bring in data, to integrate it, standardize it, deduplicate it, and create these analytics and visualizations that were almost unheard of before. And this idea of adding in, it's not just, hey, just give me your data and I'll do a bar chart, or I'll do a really cool visualization. There's steps now that can be, that can go into it to clean data. And this is the stuff that's been such a burden on organizations in the past because they've had to have staff that have had to know how to do this. And how do we reformat data? How do we combine data from different data sets? And a lot of the technology simply can do this now based on a few algorithms or a few scripts. One of the great things that technology can do is it can expand the impact of the work. So if you combine data, I think we all really want to be able to say, oh, well, my organization X had this impact in the city of Toronto. But the reality is that there's other organizations, government, nonprofits, corporations, that are all contributing to the same work. And technology can take that data from each of them, integrate it, and we can look at our impact as a whole. And we can even, in some cases, isolate and compare our work to what the government is doing. So we can look at broader impact at a community or societal level beyond just what one organization is doing. And that's something that's been really critical. Again, the technology is, before the data gets into these analytic and visualization tools, we can do a whole lot with technology to examine data quality. When we're comparing metrics, we can look at how similar or different they are if we want to combine them. So there's a lot of things that technology can help us do, both to get to impact, but also prepare us for impact.
Yeah. And so what I think is interesting, we always talk to our clients, is the principle of data minimization, to your point, but with new technology. So in the older days when there wasn't this AI kind of stuff emerging, you really had to be diligent about each data point that you put into the system. Yeah. And some of the biggest discussions we have when we're about to get clients ready to roll out their grant management systems or research management systems is what data are you going to migrate over? And to your first point, a lot of clients just want to migrate everything just in case. Yeah. But then you start with a lot of noise in the system, right? So how do we get to really just migrate the key data points that you need? Yeah. And I'd like to share an example because, again, to the point of we can't, it's too complicated. And how do you correlate? How do you attribute one output having impact on your ultimate strategy? There's a hospital in Toronto, which I find amazing, they've gotten to this point, where they've been able to integrate data from the emergency room and the hospital beds, as well as events that are happening in the city where there's a festival, the weather. So multiple data sets from both inside a hospital and outside. And they've been able to predict ER workload, so admissions and workload, within a very small range of error. Yeah. Which really, if you think about healthcare being one of the sectors where they say, well, we can't predict anything because who knows when people are going to get sick. Right. Here, they've been able to model out within very few points of error and predict what the workload's going to be in the ER, 3, 4, 5 days ahead of time. The moral implications of what they do with this information is another fascinating conversation, which we won't have today. But even when we solve the problem of impact measurement, then what do you do with that information and how do you use it?
Yeah, and it's a really good point. And you kind of just touched on this on the tip of the iceberg, but the governance of the data is a completely different story, right? And to your point, that's a great example of being able to bring in disparate data sets that are being collected from different organizations and combining them in a way that produces kind of new value out of them. And this is really kind of where Bright Hive, where I work now, is really the contribution that we're providing. And how do we create kind of shared resources that but for us combining the data from multiple organizations would not be possible. And we help provide the governance around that, because in some cases the data is sensitive or the organization doesn't want it used for certain purposes. And we can structure and detail all of that in the governance among those organizations. This has been really critical in the COVID area, especially trying to stand up very quick responses to the need to find childcare vacancies for frontline workers. And we've been able to work with states and childcare centers and research and referral centers to collect and combine their data very quickly in a kind of high-level governance structure, but also working with workforce boards. So combining employment opportunities in certain communities from different employers to allow individuals who are displaced because of COVID to find really quick jobs or employment. So the technology is able to do that quickly, and through governance, even the governance now is being done through technology, which is something that if there are any lawyers on the phone, I apologize, but we're here to make your job easier and allow folks to do this in a more efficient and systematic way. So,
excellent. So once, let's assume we get through all these things and organizations are ready to try this out, and many of them do today. This we were not meaning to make it seem like it's an impossible task. It's happening everywhere in different levels. How do they share the story of their impact, and how can we tie it to the SDGs? Because that's really kind of an overall global strategy, if you will, right?
yeah, and I love this question because it's something that I fear that organizations think about after the fact, and this really should be one of the first things that you think of. And I know there's, if I could see everybody's face when I say that, as a nonprofit or a grantee, you often have multiple requests from different funders or government that require your data to be shared in different reports. It's typically the same data, but it may be reformatted differently. You may have different time intervals. All of this stuff needs to be identified at the beginning, because this often helps determine what you're doing, what your capacity to do this. A funder may mandate one outcome, another funder may mandate a similar outcome, just measured differently. And that's all about burden on your staff. So burden is a huge thing. Do you have the systems in place to automate routine reports? You have a report due to your funder every quarter. That often takes an individual to go get the information from different folks, get it approved, and then get it sent off. Technology now helps you automate those things, and that's something that is done through some data trusts that we work with, so that you can automate. The big thing for us, in addition, is how do you share this data in a secure and responsible way? And it really depends on the goal, what your overall impact is. Are you just working in a specific community where you want to share these, broadly with community members? Do you need to satisfy a requirement to government because you're receiving federal funds or state funds or provincial funds? Or do you want to share your data with a broader community, like a community of practice, to share best practices, build capacities? And in some cases, you may just want to share your data in general and allow others to use it to incorporate it with their own data. So these are all the things that will go into it. SDGs are an interesting case because if you say, hey, we want to contribute, we want to sign on to the SDGs, that creates a little bit of path dependence, because you have to adopt certain metrics and the outcomes or the indicators that then can align with the work, aggregate within your community, and contribute to the SDGs more broadly. If you chose a metric or an indicator that the SDGs have not identified, then it's really difficult to kind of fold in your work with everybody else in that thing. I do think the SDGs allow for some of that contextual variation, which is great. And in some cases, some of those are outputs, because they realize that it's just going to look different in different contexts. Poverty in rural Mississippi is going to look much different than poverty in New York City, or in an underdeveloped country. So there has to be a level of kind of contextuality that needs to be imposed on some of those metrics and indicators, which I think is great. But depending on how you want to share, who you want to share, and for what purpose, those are the things that will go into determining what your impact is and what you're going to measure. Because if you do want to share widely, then you have to choose something that others are measuring. So you may want to choose an outcome or outputs that are fairly standard across a specific subject matter area or a specific context. If you're only concerned with doing work within your community, then you have a lot more discretion and more flexibility in what you want to do.
Excellent. David, we have a question from the audience. This person asks, to get started with impact measurement, what's the best way to get alignment within your organization about what to measure?
I think it's really just, it's just that, so when I've done this for organizations, I've done it where there's been essentially a clean slate, but also they did an initial survey, just kind of gauging what internal teams and individuals feel about the work that they do. So what is our goal? What are the, how do you view, or what are the requirements for achieving that goal from your department? Again, I will continue to emphasize that this has to be done collaboratively, and it should be done in a setting where you can present what everyone has said and allow them to kind of talk about it and debate it and compromise, because often language and semantics, like, you may think that people are saying things differently, and it may just be reflective of their background or the area where they work, but they're ultimately saying the same thing. So you can break down barriers and create alignment by having conversations and kind of diving deeper into what are the needs and preferences and capacities of those different teams. I think that that's really critical in having that conversation. It's not going to happen in one setting, but there's a series of things that you can do to capture perceptions and priorities and preferences. And I've often then said, let's bring everybody together and kind of talk about this. The other thing you'll find too is that some of those needs are sequential. Like, some things need to happen first before another team can get what they want. And for them to understand that is really critical, because then they see themselves in this broader vision and are more likely to participate and be aware, because they know this other team's going to get what they want first, but that's actually going to be a building block for what I need. And there's a common understanding that takes place within an organization to get everybody aligned and a part of that broader vision, because the reality is they're not all going to get what they want at the same time. And creating kind of that framework and that vision is really critical.
Yeah. And I'll emphasize that in response to that question, you got to start with a strategy. A lot of organizations start measuring and then you say, but what's your vision? And even with our implementations of grant management systems, I always start with the question, what's the vision? Yeah. Not just to put in a grant management system, but what are you trying to achieve as an organization so that we align it?
Yeah.
So another question here is, what's a data model? And it's a long question, but how do you embed a data model as you're thinking about impact measurement in your new systems?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to say that, and I think it builds off of your previous description. So the model is the detail about how you're going to achieve that ultimate vision or those ultimate goals. What are the outcomes that you believe will show evidence that you are achieving those ultimate goals and that broader vision? The outcomes, or the outputs, if you choose to measure those, represent certain data that is needed to actually show that evidence. I often start, you can either do this, Mariana's done this with a logic model or theory of change. The way that I tend to do it now is I start from the vision and I work backwards, because sometimes it's easier for folks, but that vision, what is preventing us from achieving that vision? That's what I call kind of data challenges. The data challenges or use cases then tell us what are the outcomes that if we were able to show would give us evidence that we're addressing those challenges and thus addressing our ultimate vision. The data challenges and the outcomes then tell us what data we need in order to calculate those outcomes or measure those. And then in certain contexts, so if you're doing this in Toronto, who owns the data? Do we have the data? Are we collecting that from our grantees? Is that owned by the city? Is it owned or controlled by some other organization? So the data model not only creates kind of the if-then statement on what needs to happen, who needs to do it, when will it happen, again, going back to sequencing and contingencies, but it's essentially the model that you're creating that details how you will achieve your ultimate goals and vision.
Okay. And I think we'll take one last question here. And that is, what has, if any, I mean, I think they think they has, but COVID, what impact has COVID had in all these impact measurement journeys, given that many of us being philanthropy, are funding just operating survival dollars, like just give me operating dollars so I can keep the lights on for the next 3 months. Like, what do you think the impact of that's going to be?
Yeah, I think there's two responses. Number one, COVID has, so I think more generally, COVID has given us another example of how we need to make the process of sharing and combining data more efficient and more collaborative. Because one of the big lessons that we've experienced, and we work with quite a few state governments, federal governments, and local regional communities, is they need to move quickly, and both the technology and governance and lack of trust or lack of understanding is really an impediment to moving quickly. So having these collaborations that are in place, and there's a kind of governance structure or a common understanding about collaborating or working together, having those in place gives you the ability to move quickly, or in some cases, leverage the data that you've already agreed upon to use in a different way. That's something that's been really critical, especially in the childcare space, where there's been agreements for sharing data from parents on looking for child care vacancies. But the ability to then use that same data and focus on frontline workers, or focus on create more opportunities for folks to get that data. It's a small shift in what we're already doing, but if you relied on the existing kind of traditional approach to data sharing, the amount of approvals and new data sharing agreements or MOUs is just really debilitating and will take weeks or months to do. But if there is an agreement in place and an understanding in place that creates the infrastructure in order to pivot quickly, that's something that is really critical. The other thing too is, and I understand the need to move quickly, so for funders to provide unconstrained dollars to just address it, the tendency I understand, but we have to do so in a way where we're learning and capturing insights and lessons so that we can prevent this from happening in the future, right? So, it's not a way to impose additional burden on nonprofits, but it should be done in the vein that, yes, we want to give you the resources to do what you do, but we also want to make sure that we're learning from this. Like, is this something that we need to incorporate in the future? As I mentioned, should we have collaborations that have a more flexible governance structure, and test that out? Yes, we want to give you the resources to serve frontline workers or examine new research questions. But what are the things that we need to put in place and create kind of that common communication and engagement with your grantees about what they're learning? What are the things that we can change in the future? It doesn't mean you have to impose conditions on the funding, but make sure that they understand that this should be collaborative and that we should be working towards how we improve and prevent something like this from happening in the future.
And further, I mean, what we have found in building, a lot of our clients have come to us and said, oh, let's build an urgent fund, COVID fund. And what we have seen is a lot of them have to be very agile. And this came out in our last fireside chat, the ability of organizations to be really agile, to your point, just to learn that, you know, sometimes reporting and evaluation doesn't have to be 20 pages of forms and boxes and more boxes that grantees burden on grantees. And with COVID, the foundations were able to think, okay, what are 3 key things we need to know that have happened with the money, and then we'll be satisfied that it was used for the correct purpose. So again, you know, minimizing the burden of reporting and still being able to evaluate the efficacy of the dollars invested. So.
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing, Mariana, that we're working on now that I've been involved in, given my prior experience and what I'm doing now, is this idea of how do we coordinate funding across funders, right? So the reality is that these nonprofits really are at the forefront. They know where to target this, but they often have to go to multiple funders simultaneously. So this idea, and I know people will smile when I say this, but this idea of a common application or a common marketplace where nonprofits can go and submit a proposal that goes to multiple funders simultaneously, or goes into a marketplace because funder A is maxed out their budget for this grant cycle, but the nonprofit doesn't know that another funder might be willing to fund this. So we're working with a couple foundations in the States now to examine what this looks like, and can we create a model that allows funders in a specific community or a region to coordinate their grant making applications, maybe even coordinate funding across multiple years so nonprofits don't have to go back every year or every 2 years to get an extension. Imagine if 3 funders could coordinate where a nonprofit could go uninterrupted for multiple years and not have to worry about submitting a new application. The other thing too is that, again, the beauty of this is that the data, once it's in a system where you're coordinating this stuff, can be used for other things. And it's really critical because it's the same data we want to use for impact. So if there's an agreement for funders to coordinate around funding, maybe there's a way that we can create a governance structure where we combine data and can look at impact more broadly. So with the right technology, with the right governance structure, with the right protections, privacy, security, and protecting individual organizations' proprietary information, we can do that through certain systems. And that's where it gets really exciting. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we have a new challenge. We can simply use the same data and agree to use it in a different way.
Thank you. So we've heard some key themes around having a vision, developing your impact measurement in a collaborative fashion, both internal and external stakeholders. Leveraging new technology will really enable you. And I love the work you guys are doing where you're bringing multiple organizations together, and the whole thought of sharing one application. Particularly, COVID has forced us all to think differently and lessen the burden on our grantees and applicants is something to keep in mind. So with those key things, I'm going to wrap up, and thank you, David, for your time. Last time we had a chat, you had your kid all over you. I'm glad today he let you talk. So I know it's hard on everybody right now to make the time, and we all appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody who attended today. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any questions afterwards, you know where to find both of us. We're happy to continue the discussion.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, Mariana. And again, a lot of this work is something that is really influential in the work that we do, and I'm trying to do more of this work. So if you have questions, any of the people attending, please feel free to reach out. I love talking and providing as much kind of help and information that I can. So don't hesitate to reach out if I can help in any way.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Be well and be healthy.